Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 49, The Congress of Arras. The Congress of Arras is sometimes hailed as the first true European peace conference. Now, this might come as a surprise to you all considering all the peace conferences I've covered in the show thus far. But the Congress of Arras was something different, more akin to the Congress of Vienna than the previous attempts at peace at, say, Auxerre, Vincennes, or Nevers. Now, I don't think that we should overstate the differences between Arras and our previous rounds of negotiation, but it was remarkable in its time. One of the things that set the Congress of Arras apart from the other peace conferences of the past few years was the sheer scale of it. Around 5,000 diplomats, ambassadors, princes, knights, attendants, guards, and servants converged on Arras in July of 1435. Delegations from France, England, and Burgundy made up the lion's share of this number, but mediators, allies, and observers from all over Europe were present. The French delegation was led by Philip's brother-in-law, the Duke of Bourbon, as these embassies tended to be headed by a magnate. But the man in charge of doing most of the actual negotiating was the Chancellor of France and Archbishop of Reims, Renaud de Chartres. Philip's other brother-in-law, Constable Arthur de Richemont, was another important member of the French delegation, but of course these men were only the tip of the iceberg, and I could probably spend the rest of the episode simply exploring the French delegation, if I were so inclined. In opposition to the French were the English. Philip the Good had been offered the leadership of the English delegation, but the Duke of Burgundy declined, as he wanted the freedom to negotiate for himself rather than for the English. The next logical choice to lead the English delegation would have been the Duke of Bedford, but he was currently sick and could not take part in the Congress, and in all honesty, he might not have wanted to attend even if he was feeling okay. The next most important figure in Lancastrian France was Cardinal Henry Beaufort, and he certainly had a role in the English delegation, but what exactly that role was is hard to say. Cardinal Beaufort initially established himself at Calais rather than at Arras, and only came to the city after the Congress had begun and when the Anglo-French negotiations seemed to be going off the rails. It is possible that Beaufort might have been empowered to authorize more concessions than the main English delegation, but in any event, his arrival at Arras did not end up changing what the English were willing to offer, and he only met with the mediators a handful of times. The actual English delegation was thus led by John Kemp, the Archbishop of York, while the rest of the delegation was a mixture of important lords and clerics, including the Earls of Huntingdon and Suffolk, and the Bishop of Norwich. But we should not be under the impression that this delegation was purely English, as just as many representatives came from Lancastrian France, including Pierre Couchon, now the Bishop of Lisieux. Additionally, there were a number of Frenchmen present who were associated with Lancastrian France and often conferred with that delegation, but were in reality part of the Burgundian contingent, such as John of Luxembourg and his nephew Louis of Luxembourg, Viscount of Saint-Pol. The Luxembourgs were among the most vocal supporters of the English in the Burgundian delegation, along with Hugh de Lannoy, who had been serving as one of the Duke's primary ambassadors to England. Fellow Knights of the Golden Fleece, John of Roubaix and Roland de Houquerque, were also prominent pro-English voices at Arras. The pro-French camp, on the other hand, was led by Niccolo Roland, the Chancellor of Burgundy, and Antoine de Croix, Philip's favorite courtier and his first chamberlain. The debate between the English and French camps had been raging for some time, and both were well represented in the Burgundian delegation at Arras. But it should be noted that the pro-French camp made up a healthy majority. In general, there seems to have been an element of geography to how the blocks within the Burgundian delegation formed. The pro-English lords and officers tended to be the ones with lands in the northwest, closest to English territory, and most dependent on trade across the Channel, while the pro-French lords and officers tended to be based either in the northeast or the south, less dependent on English trade, and more exposed to attacks from France. This wasn't a hard and fast rule. For example, Antoine de Croix, one of the most ardently pro-French lords, was based in the northwest, but it was a noticeable trend. Throughout the Congress, Philip the Good would routinely consult with his lords and representatives from his towns. But at the end of the day, the decision was his to make. As for what the Duke himself wanted, it was pretty straightforward. Philip the Good wanted peace. Now, his first choice would be for the English and French to bury the hatchet, but if this latest attempt at reconciliation failed, Philip was prepared to make a separate peace with the court of Charles VII. Many of the details of this separate peace had been discussed at Nevers earlier in the year, but there were still things to iron out, and the Duke of Burgundy was holding out hope that his allies would come to their senses and make peace as well. As much as Philip the Good wanted peace, and annoyed as he was with his allies, the Duke had sworn a solemn oath to uphold the Treaty of Troyes, and that was not the kind of thing to be abandoned lightly. However, I mentioned in the last episode that Cardinal Albergati, the primary mediator at the Congress, had a secret weapon. When the Cardinal set out for Arras, he received 2 procurations from the Pope. The first authorized him to negotiate a general peace, while the second authorized him to negotiate a separate peace between France and Burgundy. Both of these procurations followed the same general formula, but the second had an additional clause which absolved both parties from any previous oaths not to make peace with each other. Now, it was pretty obvious that this clause was included as an attempt to ease the Duke's conscience if he were to split from the English. And the fact that the terms of a separate peace had been mostly hammered out already, combined with this procuration, makes it pretty clear that Philip the Good and Charles VII were determined to leave Arras with a peace treaty, regardless of what the English did. And this implication is further emphasized in the housing arrangements of the Congress. Medieval Arras was made up of 2 parts, the Cité, or the Old Town, and the Ville, a suburb which grew up around the Abbey of Saint-Vaast. The Cité and the Ville each had their own walls and were only connected to each other by a single gate, which was closed after dark. The peace talks themselves were to take place in the Abbey of Saint-Vaast, and Cardinal Albergati stayed in the abbey. The French were to be housed in the Ville, while the English were assigned to the Cité. The separation was a good move all in all, considering the ongoing tensions between the 2 sides. In fact, the French were currently engaged in a military operation near Paris. Therefore, reducing potential run-ins between the French and English wherever possible was key to ensuring a peaceful conference. Now, you might think that the Burgundians would also be placed in the Cité with their allies, but they were actually housed in the Ville along with the French. Consequently, the nominally opposed French and Burgundians had far more contact with each other throughout the course of the conference than the English and Burgundians, who were supposed to be negotiating as a team. There were a number of meetings which took place between the English and Burgundian delegations, but more certainly occurred between the French and Burgundian delegations, simply because it was easier. Moreover, the Duke of Bourbon, Arthur de Richemont, and many other figures from the French delegation were often invited over to the Duke of Burgundy's palace in Arras for parties and social gatherings, which never included English lords. And even if the English had been invited, they would have had to leave before dark, so as to not be stuck outside the Cité when the gate was closed. The English seem to have been genuinely hurt and surprised by the extent which the Duke openly preferred the French to them. Despite their recent tensions, they had been his allies for the past 15 years, and now Philip was fraternizing with the enemy and icing them out. Before we dig into the course of the Congress of Arras, I do want to explore the mediators and the structure of the conference. We've been talking about Cardinal Niccolo Albergati for a little bit, but the Cardinal was not alone. He brought with him a handful of lawyers and secretaries, which included in their number 2 future popes, Nicholas V and Pius II. Albergati was a fairly modest man, and his company was relatively small, but the people who were a part of it were heavy hitters, influential clerics well renowned for their learning and wisdom. Although I've been focusing on Niccolo Albergati, he was not the only mediator present at Arras, and the rivalry between Pope Eugenius IV and the Council of Basel was also set to play out in the negotiations. Just as Albergati was the Pope's legate, Hugh de Lusignan, the Cardinal of Cyprus, was chosen as the legate of the Council. The Council of Basel also nominated Albergati as one of their representatives, but while he made sure to remain on good terms with the Council, he only styled himself as a representative of the papacy. It was clear to all that of the two mediators, Albergati was the primary one, although Lusignan did do his best to assert his status. Cardinal Albergati had been granted a room in the Abbey of Saint-Vaast due to his age and infirmity, so Cardinal Lusignan demanded a room there as well. The Cardinal of Cyprus then also demanded the seat of precedence in the conference room where the discussions would take place, but Albergati simply arrived in the room before Lusignan and took the seat for himself. And, much to Lusignan's consternation, petitioners flocked to Albergati's quarters, while his own were far less crowded. But that's not to say that the mediators were constantly at each other's throats. Whatever tension there was between Albergati and Lusignan did not interfere with the peace process. Even though the cardinals represented rival institutions, at the end of the day, both the papacy and the Council of Basel wanted peace between England and France, and, barring that, peace between France and Burgundy. Sooner, rather than later, Lusignan realized that everyone else recognized Albergati's precedence, and so he decided to yield for the good of the Congress, rather than throw a fit and risk derailing the negotiations. Another thing which set the Congress of Arras apart from previous peace conferences was the structure of it. Many earlier conferences had devolved into shouting matches over competing claims, and so the organizers of the conference decided that the best way to avoid that would be to prevent the English and French from ever coming into contact with each other. We've already explored how the English and French delegations were housed in completely separate areas of the city, but the actual negotiations were done through mediators rather than face-to-face. One party would present their offer to the mediators, who would then present that offer to the other party, who could then theoretically accept it, but in practice would reject it and present a counteroffer. The job of the mediators was not to control the floor or facilitate an in-person discussion, so much as it was to report, interpret, and evaluate the offers in a productive and honest manner. Any changes to the actual offer would impede the peace process more than it would help, and impartiality, or at least the appearance of it, was necessary to keep both parties at the conference. Albergati recognized the importance of his neutrality, and even though he did think that the Lancastrian claim to the French throne was illegitimate, throughout the Anglo-French negotiations, the cardinal was objective and fair. At the opening of the Congress of Arras, neither the French nor the English were willing to offer much. The initial English offer was rejected outright by the French, as it was for a truce rather than a peace. The French then declared that they would not give an offer of their own until the English made a true peace offer. But after some cajoling from the mediators, the French put forward their first offer. Henry VI would give up his claim to the French throne and all territory gained by Henry V and the Duke of Bedford, and in exchange would be given an expanded Guyenne in the south. The offered land would be significantly smaller than the expanded Guyenne granted in the Treaty of Brittany, and would be held as a fief of the French crown rather than with full sovereignty. Unsurprisingly, this offer was in turn rejected out of hand by the English, and when they gave their counteroffer, the French simply laughed at how ridiculous it was and refused to respond to it. But over the next few days and weeks, the mediators gradually got the French and English delegations to offer more to each other. However, while both delegations were willing to make territorial concessions, there were more serious issues which neither side would budge on. The English had no intention of giving up Henry VI's French crown, and even when that issue was tabled for the time being, they demanded that any territory they held in France must be held with full sovereignty. On the other hand, the French refused to even acknowledge Henry VI's claim to the French crown, and any land which they were willing to allow the English to keep must be held as a fief. Even as both sides offered more territory and other concessions, these conflicting stances were non-negotiable. The debate over how the English would hold their French territories is an old one, and one we've covered in the show on many, many occasions. And while the English claim on the French crown is also now decades old, almost 100 years old actually, the nature of that claim had changed. Edward III and Richard II had both claimed the crown of France, but neither had been crowned or consecrated, and both were willing to lay down that claim for other concessions at the negotiating table. Henry VI, on the other hand, was both a minor and a consecrated king. Not only was putting down a crown a much more serious affair than letting go of a claim to a crown, but it would be the regents of England putting down the crown on Henry's behalf, something which would be seen as a betrayal of the young king and of his father's legacy. Even though the English now had little chance of winning the war, they were constrained by the politics of honor to keep pressing for Henry's crown. Over the next few weeks, the two sides gave in more little by little, but were talking past each other on the issues that really mattered. As the Congress went on, it was clear that the English were growing restless. Their presence at the Congress of Arras was more about keeping Burgundy happy than it was about making peace, and it was clear that any French offer would be unacceptable to them, and vice versa. By early September, the English were ready to leave the Congress. The French, in a last-ditch effort to assure the Duke of Burgundy that the necessary reasonable offers had been made, put forward one last proposal. Henry VI would release his claim to the French crown, and in exchange, all of Normandy and a slightly expanded Guienne were to be given to the English. But they were to be held as a fief and not with full sovereignty. Furthermore, the English must permit exiled landowners from their territories to return and reclaim their holdings, as well as finally set a ransom for the Duke of Orleans and the other prisoners of Agincourt. The major concession from the French was that the English would be permitted to delay paying homage for those lands and delay renouncing the French crown for 7 years, when Henry VI could do so as an adult. The mediators thought that this offer was quite generous and encouraged the English to accept it, but the English delegation would not commit. They did not reject the offer outright, but instead declared that they would have to refer the matter back to the young king and the Regency Council, and prepared to leave the conference. As the English departed, Philip tried to sweeten the deal and got the French to agree to a few more concessions. The English king would have all the feudal rights of a king in his French territories, save for sovereignty and homage homage for those territories could be done by the English king's son or heir when the 7 years were up, rather than the king himself. But in the end, the deal, even with the Burgundian additions, was rejected, as must have been expected. The Lancastrian claim to the French crown simply could not be given up, and retaining their French holdings as fiefs was just as unacceptable, and a recipe to resume the endemic warfare of the 12th and 13th centuries. And even if the English were willing to budge, the lands offered by the French here were just not enough to merit considering such a deal. As the English delegation prepared to leave, Cardinal Beaufort had a personal meeting with Philip the Good. The two princes had always had a good personal relationship, even as the wider Anglo-Burgundian relationship began to crack. And the cardinal hoped that he might get Philip to leave Arras with him. The cardinal pleaded with the duke to remain loyal to the cause, while Philip exhorted the cardinal to compromise and make peace. In the end, neither argument stuck, and as the English decamped, Cardinal Beaufort and all his men wore liveries with the word honor embroidered on their sleeves, a direct message to the Duke of Burgundy. The English delegation left Arras on September the 6th, and while some might have thought that the final deal might be agreed to, most must have known that the departure of the English delegation marked the end of the peace talks. However, the Burgundians were still at Arras, and with the English gone, all eyes were now on the Duke of Burgundy. The French delegation had honestly counted on the talks with the English failing, and had been planning on how to get Philip the Good to make a separate peace since before the Congress even opened. In the first days of the conference, the French delegation discreetly paid out a total of 60,000 gold saluts to some of the most important members of the Burgundian delegation. The bribed officials included the Chancellor of Burgundy, Niccolo, as well as Antoine de Croix and his brother Jean, leaders of the pro-French bloc. But these bribes were also paid out to several other influential Burgundian lords who had taken more neutral or even pro-English stances. Moreover, Isabella of Portugal was won over by the French. Richard Vaughan writes, quote, "Here at Arras she displayed for the first time her undoubted gifts as a negotiator, but on behalf of France, not Burgundy. While the councillors received bribes beforehand, she accepted a reward afterwards. On the 21st of December, 1435, Charles VII confirmed to her an annual rent of 4,000 livres, which the Counts of Hainaut received from the French crown, and which Philip had agreed to make over to her. In the document, Charles VII explicitly states that this was because of her services in negotiating the Franco-Burgundian peace and reunion at Arras. Now that the English had decamped from Arras, a Franco-Burgundian peace deal would mean abandoning the Anglo-Burgundian alliance, and there was still much conflict within the Burgundian court about the prospect of leaving their allies. By now, Philip had committed to making peace, but there were many in the Duke's circle who preferred the English to the French. Throughout the Congress of Arras, Philip met with and consulted with his lords, allies, and representatives from his towns. At these assemblies of Burgundian lords and burghers, there was always a vocal minority unwilling to leave the English. They pointed to Philip's oath to uphold the Treaty of Troyes, to the hatreds stirred by the years of civil war, to the perfidy of Charles VII, and to the close economic relationship between England and the Low Countries. But above all, they argued that if Philip broke his alliance with the English, his honor would be seriously wounded, and no other prince would trust him again. On the other side, the pro-French camp set their lawyers to work, and argued that the Treaty of Troyes had never been valid, and so Philip had no need to abide by it. Niccolo compiled a list of all the times the English had violated the Treaty of Troyes, and argued that since the treaty had already been broken by the English, Philip no longer had to hold himself to it, even if the English infractions were not nearly on the same level as the Duke of Burgundy fully walking away from the alliance. The pro-French lords also argued that as Henry V never actually inherited the throne of France, he had no right to pass it on to his son. The pro-French camp was also now the pro-peace camp, and just as the pro-English lords had argued at Troyes that the deal with the English would put an end to the years of war in France, now the pro-French lords picked up that argument. The Treaty of Troyes had undoubtedly failed to secure peace. What's the point in sticking with the English when it would only prolong the fighting? As a prince of the blood, as the first peer of the realm, Philip had a duty to the Kingdom of France to strive for peace. The pro-French camp in the Burgundian delegation would be further reinforced by the mediators at the Congress, and this is where Albergati's second procuration came in handy. And even better, the Council of Basel had granted a similar procuration to Hugh de Lusignan. The moral authority of both Pope and Council would allow Philip to extricate himself from his oath to the Treaty of Troyes with his honor intact. And although the English might not see it that way, most of the rest of Christendom would. The mediators at Arras also began to change their tactics. In the first phase of the Congress, the mediators had remained steadfastly neutral, but as the Congress went on, they began to allow their own biases to emerge. The pro-French tendencies of the mediators first came out a few days before the English abandoned Arras, and as it became clear that they would. In one of his final meetings with the English delegation, Albergati argued that the crown of England was a fine and noble thing in itself, and that Henry VI should be content with that and leave the crown of France to the Valois. Once the English left Arras, the mediators gave up their attempts to negotiate a general peace entirely, and immediately began encouraging the Duke of Burgundy to accept a separate peace with France. For his part, Philip was prepared for this eventuality, and the Franco-Burgundian talks began in earnest. Actually, that's not entirely true. Informal Franco-Burgundian talks had been going on throughout the entire course of the Congress of Arras, but now they were out in the open. Philip the Good could now claim that he had done his best to present a reasonable peace deal to the English, and their denial of this reasonable deal could be posited as the final straw. If his allies were determined to carry on the war unjustly, he would talk peace. On September the 10th, the 16th anniversary of the murder of John the Fearless, Philip the Good held a solemn mass in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Arras, and afterwards presided over a meeting with his delegation that went late into the night. All of the arguments in favor and in opposition to a separate peace were rehashed, but at the end of the meeting, Philip declared that he would reconcile with Charles VII, and his decision was endorsed by the majority of his council. The Franco-Burgundian talks at Arras were basically the opposite of the Anglo-French talks. While the Anglo-French talks were conducted through mediators in an atmosphere of distrust and hostility, the Franco-Burgundian talks were done mainly in person and went quite smoothly. Most of the actual discussions of what a deal would look like had been hammered out earlier in the year at the Conference of Nevers. And even though the talks at Nevers had officially been to organize the Franco-Burgundian reconciliation in the event of a general peace, there was a clause at the end of the agreement that these terms could be easily adapted to a separate one. Moreover, the deal agreed to at Nevers, and by extension, the final agreement at Arras, was very much based on the abortive peace deal negotiated in 1429. Of the final 43 clauses of the Treaty of Arras, 31 more or less came directly from that deal, and in fact, 10 of the clauses could be traced all the way back to the negotiations hosted by the Duke of Savoy in 1423. The fact that there was not much more that needed to be discussed is evident in the timeline of the Congress. The Anglo-French negotiations had taken place over the course of just about a month, whereas the Franco-Burgundian deal was finalized a week and a half after the English left the Congress. And Anthony de la Taverne, whose journal is one of the main primary sources on the peace conference, reports that the Franco-Burgundian peace deal was mostly finished the very day that the English left Arras. Now, there were still some last-minute additions to the deal, although it is unclear how many of these were dealt with at Nevers versus at Arras. Most of the clauses which were hammered out in 1435 either had to do with land, titles, and property claimed by partisans of both sides, or squabbles of jurisdiction between Burgundy and the Crown. The most consequential addition around this time was a further inducement to the Duke of Burgundy to encourage him to make a separate peace. The Somme was to become a Burgundian river. Charles VII granted Philip the Good the county of Ponthieu and the towns of Saint-Quentin, Corbie, Amiens, Abbeville, Saint-Riquier, Dorlon, Crèvecoeur, Arleux, Montagne, and many others, quote, with all their dependencies whatever, and all the lands now belonging to the Crown of France from the said river Somme inclusively, comprehending the whole of the towns, as well on the frontiers of Artois, Flanders, and Hainaut, as on those of the realm of France and of the Empire of Germany. In so many words, this grant, combined with the lands he already officially held, essentially made the Duke of Burgundy the Lord of all Picardy. Even though this inducement included much more than just the towns themselves, this grant has gone down in history as the Grant of the Somme Towns. So that's how I'll be referring to it from here on out. The Somme Towns will remain important for basically the entirety of the rest of the show, so don't forget about them. If you've been paying attention to the past 30 or so episodes, you'll remember the countless times which an attack on the Burgundian Low Countries began with a fight along the Somme. So, giving the Duke of Burgundy control over the Somme helped to defend and consolidate his northern lands, and reinforced his hold on Picardy. Moreover, while not quite on the same level as the great urban centers of Flanders, the Somme towns were important and rich cities. But it's also important to note that the Somme towns were not fully ceded to Philip. The French crown reserved the right to purchase back the Somme towns for the massive sum of 400,000 écus. This arrangement was an interesting one, and it is a little unclear who came out ahead. Philip had more or less controlled the Somme towns for years now, and they were squarely in the Burgundian sphere of influence. But the Duke had no official claim to them. This deal gave Philip that official claim, but that claim came with an asterisk that the French crown could redeem it. At the time, the state of French finances made it extremely unlikely that the Somme towns would be redeemed, but they were not necessarily a permanent part of Burgundy. The Treaty of Arras also recognized Philip's control of the castleries of Péronne, Montdidier, and Roye, as well as the Auxerrois, the bailiwick of Mâcon, the county of Boulogne, and some other lands in Champagne and Picardy, all gains from either the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War or the 100 Years' War. In fact, the French recognized almost all of the Duke of Burgundy's gains under the English, except for the counties of Champagne and Brie, which Philip had never really tried to establish his hold over in the first place. Furthermore, the French agreed to make amends for the murder of John the Fearless. Charles VII would formally apologize for the deed, as well as fund masses to pray for the late Duke's soul, and would build monuments to his memory. Philip the Good was also permitted the privilege of never having to pay homage to Charles VII, the man behind his father's death. And for the remainder of the Duke's life, his French territories would be removed from the French king's jurisdiction. Philip would be a vassal to Charles in name only. Charles VII paid a high price for peace with Burgundy at the Congress of Arras, and many in the French delegation felt that the price was too high. But in practice, the Treaty of Arras would never be fully implemented. Charles never would endow the masses for the soul of John the Fearless, nor would he construct the promised monuments to his memory. More consequently, just as Charles backslid on his agreement to cede several towns to the Burgundians in 1430, after the Treaty of Arras was signed, the French king began to claim jurisdiction over a handful of enclaves in the lands he ceded to the Duke. In addition to the quarrel of the enclaves, Charles VII also made consistent use of the Parlement, the French royal law courts, to encroach on Philip's rights and powers, even though the Duke was technically exempt from its jurisdiction. The hatreds of the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War and of the 15 years of Anglo-Burgundian alliance could not be easily papered over. And while many in France were keen to welcome the reconciliation of Duke and King, Charles VII would never trust Philip the Good. So, this begs the question, was the Treaty of Arras a mistake? That's certainly a big question, and one that we can't really answer right now. Rather, it's something to just keep in mind throughout the course of the coming episodes. On one hand, the war was going poorly. French fortunes were clearly on the rise, and the Anglo-Burgundian alliance had little chance of winning the war outright. But by abandoning their alliance, the Burgundians basically shut the door on any chance of the English coming out of the war ahead, and paved the way for the French to continue their resurgence. The fortunes of the Burgundian state had been built in a time of French weakness. Was there a place for a strong Burgundy in a strong France. There are good arguments to be made that the Treaty of Arras was necessary to save Burgundy in the short term, but there are equally good arguments to be made that it doomed Burgundy in the long run. But when the Treaty of Arras was proclaimed, it was greeted with joy and relief by many in France and Burgundy, and there was a real feeling of optimism for the future. However, the significant pro-English camp within the Burgundian court viewed the treaty with more apprehension. While many bit their tongues and agreed to follow their duke and make peace, Hugh de Lannoy, John of Luxembourg, and a few other important pro-English lords outright refused to swear to uphold the Treaty of Arras in the closing ceremonies of the Congress. Lannoy capitulated a few days later, but Luxembourg remained with the English for the rest of his life. September 1435 marked the end of an era for the English in France, and while they had been on the back foot for the past 6 years, it was this month that really sealed their fate. Not only did the Treaty of Arras mark the death of the Anglo-Burgundian alliance, but a week earlier, John, Duke of Bedford, died in Rouen. The Duke of Bedford was an immensely capable commander and administrator. He had led the English to the height of their power in France, but he had also seen the beginning of the decline. Still, though, no one in England, apart from his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was willing to claim that Bedford had failed them across the Channel. And in his lifetime, he commanded the respect of both the English and the French. Without the leadership of Bedford, the English project in France would have undoubtedly collapsed years earlier. Now, as the English have to face the fallout from Arras, their strategy in France will be chaotic and confused. Philip the Good has made an enemy of England, and with the death of the Duke of Bedford, the always anti-Burgundian Humphrey of Gloucester is more powerful than ever. The long-awaited reconciliation with France will not be quite as smooth as Philip the Good might have hoped, and the Duke of Burgundy will have to adjust to a new reality. Next time, we're going to see Philip navigate his new diplomatic situation as the French, English, and Burgundians all wake up to the post-Arras world. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Elliot, Graf von Kravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Soie, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Merceau, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Semur, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quentin, Graf von Blasfeld, Ian, Graf von Arenberg, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, Olivier, Comte d'Ussert, John, Graf von Helmont, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can find me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com, and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.